Today we're continuing our discussions on James Monroe's presidency, the era of good feelings, pushing into Adams and Jackson administrations. Look at the economics of the time period. The Second Bank of the United States, the Market Revolution, the Transportation Revolution, Panic of 1890, Missouri Compromise, the Adams-O'Neill Street, the Monroe Doctrine, the Corrupt Bargain, as it was called, 1824, Tariff of Abominations, as it was called, the Andrew Jackson, his presidency, the Nullification Crisis, the Indian Removal Act, and the Supreme Court case Worcester versus Georgia. Now, a lot of American history, an understanding of it does come down to economics. How's money being made? Why is it being made in a certain way? Who's making it? Who isn't? Now, one advantage the United States has had throughout most of its history was it could devote most of its resources to internal improvements, business investments, purchase of land, and so forth. It didn't have a large chunk of the economy going to defense or other external concerns. The United States didn't have a large military, we didn't have a large navy, we had enough, but it just wasn't needed. This was a time period in which it's thought the Atlantic Ocean was a barrier. It would take 2 weeks for news to get from one end of the Atlantic to the other. So countries just simply wouldn't take the time and effort to send an army all the way across the Atlantic Ocean against the United States, especially after Great Britain had so many problems. Now, you do have other countries in the Americas that are spending a lot on defense. They have very large standing armies, but they have a lot of problems as a result of it. Spending a ton of money they don't have on defense. Since they're not usually fighting any wars, usually they're using these militaries to suppress their own populations. And these militaries are sitting around bored and they decide to overthrow the government. They've had real problems with democracies being established in some of these countries because of that. And because they're trying to keep their military happy and trying to fight these civil wars, you have a large chunk of their economy is going to defense. You don't have that in the United States. The United States, the largest military concern was Great Britain, followed that by Native American tribes. But while the United States would be spending the bulk of its military efforts on the tribes, the problems of Great Britain and other great European powers is only a minor concern after the War of 1812. Consider what happens. Take a look here on page 273 in your book. Relations with Great Britain after the war were slowly improving. Particularly in 1817, you have the Rush-Bagot Agreement. Agreement that demilitarized the Great Lakes. There's not be a naval arms race on the Great Lakes between the United States and British Canada. So that's one concern the United States would not have to worry about. Followed even further about the Convention of 1818. That sets a northern border for the Louisiana Purchase. On the line 49 degrees north latitude. So if you look at a lot of maps of the United States, it may look like a curved line. That's because most maps you're trying to project a round three-dimensional world onto a two-dimensional piece of paper. So it looks a little distorted, but The projection they're using here on page 273 shows a straight line. Now this the Convention of 1818, this northern boundary, though, extends only to the Rocky Mountains. Beyond that, you have the Oregon Country. Now, eventually, they eventually agreed to simply a joint occupation between the U.S. and Great Britain until the 1840s. So kind of a no man's land between the two.
Wasn't there a similar agreement between Britain and Russia later?
Probably over Canada, but between a Yukon Territory, British Columbia, Alaska, but that's quite different. Russia did have a claim to the Oregon Country, but they were U.S. and Britain just kicked it out altogether. Britain agrees to fishing rights for American fishers off Labrador, Newfoundland again. So what happens, the result is, from the Pacific Ocean all the way out to the Atlantic, you have the longest unfortified border in the world. Still is to this day. U.S. and Canada get along fairly well. They don't have any problems with each other. We're close allies. They just walk back and forth across the border, pretty much. It's simply just not an issue. Now, the only sticking point between the U.S. and Britain was the U.S. was still prohibited from trading to the West Indies, but it's becoming less and less of an issue. So the United States does not have to worry about its northern border. There are some issues over its southern border with Spain, but those can be resolved here for terribly long. But at this point, 1816, 17, 18, Spain is really not much of an issue in North America. Spain barely has the ability to take care of its own territory. They're not going to spend what few resources they have antagonizing the United States. Now, Second Bank of the United States. It's in 1860. The old bank charter had its charter expire in 1811. So President Madison, who never liked the bank, just let it expire. Well, once the War of 1812 came up and no one was willing to loan the United States government money, or no one of any significant stature or resources, Madison and Monroe, who had long been opponents of the Bank of the United States, realized the United States had to have the Bank of the United States. We had to have a source of money, source of loans for the United States government in case of an emergency. A national emergency like wartime, the United States simply couldn't afford to be going from bank to bank begging for money. So the Second Bank of the United States was created in 1816. Again, there were some protests. Again, the same arguments had against the bank in 1790-91. But it was modeled after the first bank. The federal government putting up $35 million, but on a fifth of the stock, and named 5 of the 25 directors. What this meant as a result was you now have a large bank with a lot of capital to loan out. What's going to happen is emerging businesses, potential landowners, states and communities looking to invest in their own infrastructure, they can now go to some place that has the money, give them the huge loan they need. Which meant they could start building the United States. They start accelerating the process and developing the resources the United States has. Because they have the money available to do it. Or yes, they have the manpower, they have the land, but if you're going to build all these things, you have to pay these people doing it. So, until your project start making money, you want to make sure you're paying for it. Now, because of this, you have kind of an explosion of state banks. Some getting loans from the Bank of the United States started up, some being started by their own states. 1815 have 88 state banks. 1817 to go to 208, a very short time. And the banks, for all the problems they do have, though, that is an important economic engine for the developments of these states and territories. And there's a difference between a state bank and a national bank. A state bank is just a bank that can do business within that state. A national bank can do business across state lines. So you have something like Smackover State Bank, they can only do business within the state of Arkansas. But Bancorp South or First Financial, because they're a national bank, a national association, they can do business across state lines. That's the way their corporations are. There's also another issue here. The treaty, again, because you have this peace now between U.S. and Britain, all the embargoes are gone, are done and over with, and so you have all these cheap British imports flooding the United States. So in 1816, Congress passes its first protective tariff ever, the Tariff of 1860. Again, a protective tariff, not one for revenue, not one just to pay the bills, but one designed to raise prices on incoming products so high that you have no choice but buy the American product. Essentially trying to shield American industry from foreign imports. Something still controversial even today. Well, Southern farmers and New England shippers both opposed the tariff. They felt it was damaging their businesses. That is, the people trying to sell things abroad and ship things abroad, they're upset because we raise tariffs on their products, they'll be raising tariffs on our products. It meant not many people would be buying our products abroad. What ends up happening, though, is a lot of Southern congressmen vote for this tariff anyway. See, in the 1810 census, Southern states had almost as many manufacturers as the North. Cotton gins, textile mills, and so forth. Industrialization is starting. But this point, mid-1810s, it's fairly even in North and South. What's going to end up happening, though, is the planters in the South, the ones with all the money, they're not going to be making money fast enough off these textile mills or cotton gins, and aren't going to be wanting all this competition among the upper classes, among these businessmen, so they're steadily going to cut off investment in the industry in the South. Instead, they're going to be investing all their resources more and more into larger plantations, more slaves, more land. But the North, where they don't have as much slavery, if you have any at all, and depending on what state you're in at this point, all the excess capital they have is going to be invested in industry, into factories. They're taking the money and putting it in different places. As a result, the North is going to start industrializing much faster than the South. Before long, New England is quickly surpassing the South in manufacturing, and the South grew increasingly hostile to the tariff. The South would not modernize. The South would not change. The Northeast did change. As a result, the South was being left behind. The war also highlighted the need for improved transportation. There's something started called the Transportation Revolution. You had the federal government, the state governments commissioning roads. And sometimes just clear paths in the wilderness or just simply markers pointing one road marker to the next marker, but a road, a bridge, canals especially. They start popping up more and more after the War of 1812, which meant it was now easier to get from point A to point B. Much quicker, much safer, which meant reduced time, reduced loss, increased profit. One particular project was the National Road, also called the Cumberland Road. These aren't paved roads yet. It's all dirt. Completed by Jefferson in 1806, and construction began in 1811. By 1818, only reached from Cumberland, Maryland, up to Wheeling, Virginia, on the Ohio River by 1818. By 1838, they managed to expand all the way out to Illinois. So it became an important halfway point road between the countries. Basically, the midpoint of the country moving straight west, all the way out to Illinois. And this is the first federally financed interstate road. The federal government's putting money into this road, across state lines, and trying to bring the nation closer together, making it easier to transport goods and people from point A to point B. You also have many other federal roads being constructed, also state roads being constructed, even private turnpikes. Those weren't very popular, but you found a few here and there. So what happens as a result is commercialization of agriculture, called the market rivers. Before this, you had these people way out on the frontier. Their nearest neighbor is 5-10 miles away. So what you're doing is, all the crops you're producing is just for subsistence growth. Just enough to feed yourself and your family. Everything you produced for clothing and everything else, what you produced at home. You didn't worry about profit because you had everything that you needed. Complete subsistence, complete self-sufficiency. But then all of a sudden, the roads start coming in. They were still might be a few miles away, but you've got a road to make it easier to get to your neighbor or the nearest town. More settlers start coming in. Next thing you know, you got neighbors really up close to you, maybe a mile away. And so all this excess, any excess you're producing, or start producing excess, you start selling over the market and start making money off it. It changes the nature of the frontier economy from self-sufficiency to market orientation, producing for profit. So now farmers are producing more, people are more interconnected, people start trading back and forth, people start specializing. So more people are making more money. Well, by 1825, thousands of miles of turnpikes cover the Northeast, crisscrossing each other in every which direction. All these turnpikes are the toll roads that are expensive, so they transported goods expensive by land. So a lot of people started doing more and more was transportation by canal and river. Now, we may not think about it much today, but the United States has an excellent river system. We've got these large rivers spanning most of the country. You can get from one area to another, very navigable, take you all the way down to the major oceans. Except today, in the 21st century, you may not think about it, but the Ouachita River was a major major source of transportation, transporting goods and people up and down Ouachita for many years. Camden was a major city because of transportation on the Ouachita River. There was a big port there on Camden.
Ouachita River, you say?
Yeah, the Ouachita River. The Mississippi River became incredibly important because transporting goods up and down from one end of the country to the other. New Orleans became such an important city because it's right at the intersection of the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico. Next, the Ohio River, transporting goods and people from Pennsylvania all the way up to the Mississippi River, and down to the Mississippi River tributaries from there. So a lot of states and the communities, and even private corporations, started doing was started dredging rivers, make them more navigable, and where there aren't rivers available, built canals, tons of canals. Actually, you had canals connecting rivers, connecting lakes, greatly speeding up ease and the ease of transportation. Next, in Indiana, they built so many canals the state ended up going bankrupt. But it made the state industrial and agricultural powerhouse because they had that transportation system in place. In Arkansas, you don't have a lot of canals being built, so transportation slowed down, but there are a lot of rivers trying to get goods, people from one end of the state to the Mississippi River area and out the other. One of the most successful of these canals of the Transportation Revolution was the Erie Canal. This is completed in 1825. The Erie Canal is built in the state of New York. Built by the state. I'll pretend this is New York here. Long Island. As you got here, starting in New York City, is the Hudson River, going up north. And you got here is Lake Erie, takes you to the Great Lakes and so forth further east. That's what the Erie Canal did, was it connected the Hudson River here out to Lake Erie. The ground was flat, the soil was good, so they could build a successful canal system. They had enough water to supply the canal. And so what it did was, once it's completed, you could go all the way from here to New York, travel up Hudson River, cross the Erie Canal to the Great Lakes, and then from there, you could get out to Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Minnesota. You go all the way out there in a week. Traveling overland, it'd take you a month or more. So dramatically speeding up the ease of good commerce. And plus, the Erie Canal, you don't have to cross mountains. It's really smooth sailing the whole way. The Erie Canal was so successful that New York is making the state of New York is making a ton of money off of this. So it gives New York the reputation nicknamed the Empire State because they made so much money off this canal. They're still using it up to the eve of the Civil War. And New York, as important as it was with the distribution and port of the East Coast, becomes even more important because they start having all these goods being shipped east from the Midwest. Well, Pennsylvania, just to the south, got a little bit jealous and started trying to build its own canal, which is a problem because the geography is entirely different. You've got the Appalachian Mountains coming through this region, but what you have here, the Alleghenies coming into southern New York and coming across most of central Pennsylvania, is kind of a blank spot here where you get to the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York. See, Pennsylvania had this problem because they had all these mountains in the middle of the state. There are two basic rules of plumbing. Water doesn't run uphill, payday's Friday. Well,
That's my reference to all the time because he is a plumber.
There
I
you
didn't
go.
think anybody else knew that.
yeah. Basic physics. You got the Ohio River coming up here into Pittsburgh, but again it stops here in the middle of the mountains. The Delaware River here in the east, Philadelphia, and it's not exactly scale. So Pennsylvania tries building lakes and reservoirs, trying to feed this canal, trying to push it further east, but they just couldn't do it. It's too expensive. The geography just didn't work right. In the 1850s, they're still working on this. They actually had to finish it by railroad. Connecting by railroad. So the Pennsylvania Canal never worked. Erie Canal was very successful because New York was just in the right place and built just at the right time. Pennsylvania wasn't able to pull off the trick. But nevertheless, these canals are essential for speeding up commerce, agriculture, industrialization, and moving people from this end of the country out to the Midwest. So the Northwest starts being populated much more rapidly than the Southwest. because you have this infrastructure in place all the way out here in Michigan, Illinois, and Ohio. They don't have it in Alabama or Mississippi. Now, James Monroe himself was a kind of a quiet man. At the age of 16, he left college at Princeton, walked toward Washington's Revolutionary Forces at the Battle of Princeton, served in the American Revolution, rose to be a lieutenant colonel, had a career as a former Virginia governor. During the War of 1812, he twice doubled as Secretary of State and War Secretary, diplomat. And he like Madison, kind of saw the need and the importance of all this development of infrastructure. So he sees that America is changing, sees that America has to change if it's going to be a successful nation in what is still a very dangerous world. So Monroe is carefully guiding this along. He's not as strong a proponent as some people is, but he's pushing it along just enough that the United States is able to make progress. Consider these numbers. Between 1800 and 1840, again, because of this development of infrastructure and the development of the market economy, agricultural output is expanding 3% every year between 1800 and 1840. Steady increasing output of agricultural goods. Because of that, the United States is pretty much beating Europe. Most of these new products going for sale in the open markets, usually through the United States and Europe. You have iron and steel plows coming along, making it a lot easier to plow and till the soil. Before this is wooden plows they're using. So putting a iron or steel blade on it makes it a lot easier to cut through the soil, mud, clay in the different parts of the country. So you start farming a lot easier, a lot more productively. So better strains of crops are coming available, new harvesting techniques, good lands coming available, helping feed this increase in agricultural production. But you see the differences between the two halves of the country. The north, wheat is still the main cash crop. In the south, depending on where you were, he's making the most money on what products. The upper south, still tobacco. In South Carolina, rice. Southern Louisiana, sugar. Increasingly across the lower south, cotton. Again, because of one particular invention, cotton gin. Eli Whitney built this in 1790. His way of speeding up the process of cleaning and cultivating short staple cotton. Basically getting all the seeds out of it, getting cleaned up, putting it in big bales so they can ship it off. Now cotton was being needed by all these textile mills in the Northeast. Why? Because they're taking this cotton, producing it into cloth, and then into clothing. Whenever a country industrializes, it's the first thing to start doing is producing clothing because you have a built-in market. If you can buy cloth, if you can buy clothing already pre-manufactured, it saves you a lot of time and effort instead of having to do it yourself.
Was it Eli Whitney, the one who invented the cotton gin?
Eli Whitney. Mm-hmm. So the labor costs involved are cut dramatically, time processing dropped dramatically. So cotton is a much more valuable crop, especially because of industrialization, more people are wanting it. So cotton is becoming the primary crop of the Deep South, from Georgia all the way out to Arkansas and East Texas. But because it's a labor-intensive crop, you have increasing numbers of plantations being developed in the region. Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. Between 1817 and 1840, those three states, cotton production tripled. Going from 461,000 bales to 1.35 million bales. And of course, who's doing all the planting, all the harvesting? Slaves. If you don't have to pay for, if you don't have to worry about, people basically do all the dirty work in the hot sun, while the landowner sits back and collects all the profits. So they're doing all the work, but in the north, because you can't grow cotton in Minnesota, you got wheat, you got grains you're growing. Basic food staples. And for these types of crops, you don't need a large, constant labor force. Farm family can take care of it on its own. Hard work of planting, hard work of harvest, but in the meantime, while you're basically watching it grow, it's not a lot of work. Or not nearly as much as rice, sugar, and cotton.
They grow a lot faster as well.
Yeah. Maybe pull a couple, 2 or 3 crops in a year, depending on how you manage your land. Yeah. Which meant the north, you don't need it. You wouldn't need such a large labor force. And whatever excess labor force you do have, then go do something else. Work in the factories, work in transportation, build these roads and canals. All that excess money is not going to buy more slaves to replace the ones that died or to build a bigger plantation. It's going into transportation. Bonds to, state bonds to finance these roads and canals and bridges. Investments in banks, investments in factories. The profits are going to 2 different places. South, to subsidize the luxury of the few. And the north, spread out much more evenly, invested in many different places, private industry, and public works, which benefits everybody. In fact, by 1850, the difference is so dramatic between North and South that one man traveling from New York to Virginia, which is considered to be a fairly advanced state in the South, a very prosperous state, was stunned by just how backwards Virginia was. Very few roads. What words there were in very poor condition. Very few factories, very little investment in public works. The South had fallen behind because they wouldn't change. They had everything they wanted, everything they needed. They didn't realize they're pushing themselves to becoming obsolete. The North was moving towards an industrialized, technical future. Technology, industry, growth was going to happen in the North because they were responding to market needs. The South was not. Now, by the end of the 1820s, 2/3 of all clothing worn by Americans produced at home by wives and daughters. Usually it's the women do that work. A steadily growing textile factories in the North, you start having all this clothing being produced in factories. Particularly in the 1820s, Lowell, Massachusetts became a center of manufacturing. It had a large concentrated workforce available to manufacturers. What they ended up doing was they started employing women in a lot of these factories because women worked a lot cheaper than men. This is more than 100 years where they had equal pay being the law. A lot of women taking up these jobs because there was some independence they would not ordinarily have had otherwise. What you start seeing, though, in the factories in Lowell, though, is a very paternalistic attitude. That is, these large factories, and we see after the Civil War, factory towns, you'd have a very regimented workforce. Except for the women at the Lowell factories, they had a strict 10 o'clock curfew. They lived in supervised dormitories. They had evening classes such as reading and so forth, but a strictly controlled life. So they told you where to go, who to see, when you could go out, when you couldn't go out. But it was a steady paycheck. You start seeing the same thing after the Civil War. Whole towns are telling men where to live, where to shop, where to work, when you can and can't go, where you spend your money, even who to vote for. Strictly regimented lives. But you start seeing more and more, though, in the 1820s and 1830s, is development of early labor unions. You have some men working in these very regimented conditions, so they start forming called working men's societies. They're demanding more and more basic rights as to consideration for safety in the workplace. They have to work 12, 14 hours. Shorter hours, they have to work 12, 14 hours, 6 to 7 days a week. Higher pay. And basic safety precautions make sure that men aren't dying in the job or getting their arms ripped off in a factory accident. And this is starting to affect policy of the Northeast as well. When we get to 1890, the steady economic expansion we have after the war comes to a crashing halt. Banks panicked by calling in outstanding loans. You had a lot of banks failing. Depositors and investors lost everything. A lot of these new lands being bought in the West being bought on credit. And what the result was farmers late on their payments. The banks panicked, called in these loans. Farmers end up losing their farms they're still paying off. The problem was banks calling in all these loans try to pay off their own debts. They couldn't collect enough fast enough to avoid bankruptcy. So they ended up going bankrupt, and everyone had anything in those banks, the shareholders plus the depositors. They didn't have deposit insurance yet. Lost everything. So you have the brief, short, severe depression in the United States. And speculators, people investing in these banks, these lands, are blamed for the whole situation. Blamed for putting poor management, poor business decisions ahead of sound financial growth. The Bank of the United States worsened the crisis by asking state banks to redeem their state notes in gold or silver. They're simply in the bills they're printing off, which is basically an IOU for the state bank. They said, pay us back in actual gold or silver. State banks didn't have it. So the state banks put all these loans out to the Bank of the United States. They lose everything. They end up going bankrupt. Well, in 1821, Congress responded by passing a relief act, made it allowing for easier payment terms for tracts bought on federal lands. But President Monroe didn't expect people want him to do very much. And in 1821, people really didn't expect the federal government to do very much. There's still mostly a farming economy. As long as there's land available, people felt like they could manage. Some states did respond by passing bank reform measures. In the South, the homestead legislation became popular, basically forbidding banks to foreclose on people's homes. And all these laws were modified of the next economic panic, Panic of 1837. Next along comes the Adams-O'Neese Treaty. There's increasing expansionist drive in the United States. The U.S. sees its neighbors, thinly populated Canada, and the Spanish-owned lands into what is now the American Southwest and Mexico, ripe for expansion. Weakly protected, thinly populated. U.S. is looking to move outward. Well, Spain had been severely weakened by wars in Europe, and even more so after the Napoleonic Wars. Meanwhile, the U.S. is looking at Texas, California, and Florida for expansion. In the 18 teens, Spain had little influence in Florida beyond simply a couple small enclaves in the Panhandle. The Creek tribes and escaped slaves taking refuge in Florida, basically escaping from Georgia and Alabama into northern Florida, forming a new group called the Seminoles. Creek language, that roughly means a runaway or separatist. And Spain is unable to pacify the border, is unable to prevent cross-border raids, which is required under Pinckney's Treaty in 1795. Well, in 1816, American forces clashed with a group of escaped slaves and taken over Havana, British Fort, the Florida side. Seminoles were fighting with the settlers across the area. And in 1817, Secretary of War John C. Calhoun authorized military action against the Seminoles, basically wherever they were in American territory, north of the Florida border. And so who's going to be the one taking up that order in 1817 in the South? Andrew Jackson, still senior most military officer. Calhoun authorized military action, ordering Jackson to pursue Seminoles to Florida, but not to enter into Spanish territory. Jackson, frustrated by this, wrote a letter to President Monroe saying he could take all of Florida in 60 days if Monroe just gave the word. Monroe sent a response, rather cryptic response. We're not sure exactly what he said. Jackson destroyed the letter. What it was Monroe said to Jackson, not long afterward, Jackson charges into Florida. And just as promised, takes the whole of Florida in a very short time. Now, Monroe denied he had intention to order Jackson to take Florida, but Jackson destroyed the letter. Who knows what he said? Might have said, if you invade Florida, there's nothing I can do to help you, or if something goes wrong, you're on your own, or if you can think you can take it, but I'm not going to support it publicly. Who knows what he said? But Jackson went into Spanish territory and took the whole thing. Well, Jackson pushed through western Florida, taking a Spanish fort, destroying Seminole settlements. He hanged 2 Seminole leaders at barely a trial, seized Pensacola, and by June of 1818, all Florida is in Florida Panhandle in American hands.
Kind of sounds like that Jackson was kind of overzealous.
A little bit. Said that's always one word to describe Jackson. Obviously, the Spanish are furious at this. Some concern being raised in Washington over this, but maybe Jackson went a little too far, but Spain really is in a position to protest at this point. Monroe's inclined to disavow Jackson's attacks, really not saying anything much one way or another. Calhoun's inclined to discipline Jackson for attacking the Spanish posts. In fact, even suggested to President Monroe that Jackson be disciplined. But Jackson publicly is untouchable. American people are cheering him on for taking out Florida. In the meantime, this is helping the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. Adams, eldest son of John Adams, he is a diplomatic whiz. He'd been American ambassador to 4 different countries by this point, and now he's Secretary of State. And he's negotiating with Spain over the western border for Louisiana Purchase. Well, by 1819, Jackson's troops had withdrawn, but Spain knew they could return at any time, and Adams explained this up, said, well, you know, this Jackson guy, he's completely out of control. We can't do anything with him. So, with the Spanish ambassador, Senor Onís, they ended up negotiating the Adams-Onís Treaty. (1819). See it again in your book, page 273. What it does is, After lengthy negotiations, Spanish gave ground, the U.S. gave ground. Florida incident used as leverage. And Adams gets through this an official U.S. border all the way to the Pacific Ocean, recognized by Spain. Spain dropped its claims on Oregon. Spain gave up Florida in return for assumption of private claims of Americans against Spain, about $5 million, as the U.S. would pay off these claims. Spain gives Florida to the United States. U.S. agrees to western border of the Sabine River, basically giving up its very thin claims on Texas, stair-stepping up to the 42nd parallel. Basically, the northern border of California. So the northern border of California, Nevada, Utah, that whole area, down to the Canadian River, down to the Red River, and the Sabine River down to the Gulf of Mexico. So that would be the western border for Louisiana Purchase. Basically, the U.S. giving up a very thin claim on Texas from Louisiana Purchase for a non-existent claim on Florida. Basically, Texas for Florida. Works out very well. Jackson named the first territorial governor of Florida. And the U.S. is steadily expanding. Now we have the entire east coast of the Atlantic. Now we get to 1820. Well, growth is starting to show some problems. 1817, the Missouri Territory is applying for statehood. There are about 2,000 to 3,000 slaves in the territory. The proposed state constitution made no provisions for the freedom. So unless Congress took some kind of action, Missouri would be coming into the Union as a slave state. Well, it's kind of a problem because what's happening by this point was states were being paired together to come into the Union. For a slave state, a free state. Missouri's kind of down the list on the line, but there's no state at this point to offset Missouri. No free state ready to come in yet. So what happened by this point, you have Ohio and Louisiana coming in, but afterwards you have free Indiana for slave Alabama, slave Mississippi for free Illinois. So at this point you have, by 1819, 11 free states, 11 states each. 22 states so far. And Missouri messed up the whole balance. See, what's starting to happen at this point is people are starting to notice this difference between North and South. The slave issue is starting to become an important critical concern. The North resented Southern control of the presidency. 1820, you have all but 4 years of the presidency being controlled by people from Virginia, a slave state. Also upset at the Three-Fifths Compromise gave the South an unnatural advantage in apportionment. And the South is fearing for the future balance between the free states and the slave states because the North is growing much more rapidly than the South. Example, after the 1810 census, North has 105 seats in the House of Representatives. The South has only 81. 105 in the free states, 81 in the slave states. They're even in the Senate. And you have Southerners controlling the presidency. Now the North is growing even faster than the South, so the 1820 census, this gap is expected to be even wider. The South is falling behind. The North is growing much more rapidly than the South. So Congressman James Talmadge of New York comes in and introduces a resolution prohibiting further introduction of slaves into the Missouri Territory and provides the freedom for others once they reach the age of 25. It was basically gradual emancipation. Well, the debate resumed in December 1819 after Congress adjourned in March. Congress only met 4 months out of the year at this point. But the debate's really kind of devoid of moral arguments. Rufus King of New York argued that Congress had the right to regulate slavery in the territories. Remember, the Constitution, Article 4, says Congress has the power to regulate the territories. William Pinckney of Maryland argued the states were equal and Congress didn't have a right to put conditions on Missouri for admission to the state. The Southerners started to fear, okay, they put conditions on Missouri, what about the other slave states? What about the other future slave states? Henry Clay of Kentucky is arguing that Spanish dispersal slaves would improve their condition. So basically, it wouldn't be the most intense problems of slaves were in areas where there was a large slave population, a large concentration of slaves. As Henry Clay is saying, spread it out a little bit, it won't be a problem. But you have few people arguing that slavery is a positive benefit at this point. Still using this point is the necessary evil argument. People saying, yeah, I don't like it, but using very crude economic terms, explaining why slavery is necessary for the South, how they convince themselves they need slavery. But yeah, nobody likes it, but it has to be done. You see this argument quite commonly in the 1820s and 1830s. But as the North grows and the abolitionist movement grows, it starts happening by the 1840s and 1850s is the argument shifts to the positive good argument. Slave owners, feeling kind of under siege and attack, start defending slavery, saying it's a good thing and they're glad they're doing it. Basically, the two sides becoming steadily alienated from each other. But you're not at that point in 1820. So the South simply couldn't figure out a way beyond the problem of labor and what to do with the slaves so that they're free. Basically, they couldn't figure out a solution to this problem. They didn't want to figure out a solution to the problem. Well, the District of Maine comes in and helps solve the problem, at least in the short term. Maine, discussed by Massachusetts, wanted to be separate, become its own state. It's still part of Massachusetts at this point. And so what happens is Henry Clay, Speaker of the House, balances Maine's petition for admission with Missouri's. So the two states would be even. So here's what happens. The Compromise of 1820, it's called the Missouri Compromise. So no one's threatening war or secession at this point, but Congress is immediately recognizing, people across the country recognizing slavery is becoming a problem. It's one they're going to have to deal with in the future, one that's going to tear the country apart eventually. So for now, they're going to agree to a compromise. They're going to agree to disagree. Try to fight for a future balance between North and South. So that's how it works out. The first part, Maine is admitted as a free state. It's the 23rd state in 1820. 2, Missouri is admitted as a slave state. In 1821. Now, in Missouri, most of the slaves are based in the Missouri River Valley and the Mississippi River Valley. A few in the Ozarks, but very few north of the Missouri River. And so, to prevent any kind of future problem, they decided to add in a new provision that in the territory of the Louisiana Purchase, no slaves would be admitted in the area north of line 36 degrees 30 minutes. Basically, expanding a dividing line between north and south. The remainder of the Louisiana Purchase, 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude. Basically, the Arkansas Territory was created in 1819 as part of this compromise. The Missouri-Arkansas border is 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude. Well, the way that people are thinking about the Great Plains, Great American Desert, not a lot of people are expecting states to be emerging from the Great Plains anytime soon. In the south, you had Arkansas and Florida. And you still had a couple of territories that could become states in the north. So basically, they create an even balance between north and south. The Mason-Dixon line, the Ohio River, to the 36-degree, 30-minute line, that's the border line between slavery and freedom. Now, people expected the United States to expand eventually, but in 1820, they're not quite sure how that's going to shape up at this point. They're not going to build the compromise on the basis of what could be 20, 30 years from that point. They have to build this balance based on what exists in 1820. And have a compromise that is balance between north and south. This becomes very important in the imaginations of the American people because it meant that no matter what kind of problems North and South have with each other, no matter what kind of arguments they have, the two can still sit down and come to an agreement. The great American principle that a deal's a deal. So for now, the slavery question is solved with a careful balance. In the 1820 election, you have the panic of 1819 going on. You have a very compromised debate. So do you think James Monroe will be facing a lot of opposition that year? Ordinarily you would think so, but the opposition party's collapsed. The Federalists are gone. James Monroe doesn't have organized opposition in 1820. The election of 1820, you have just James Monroe. Yep, Brett wins by default. Goes to the Electoral College. You have all the electoral votes go to Monroe except for 3 abstentions and one vote from New Hampshire for Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. Basically not because he's opposed to Monroe, but simply because Washington would be the only president who would be elected and re-elected unanimously. On 1823, the Monroe Doctrine. In 1823, Russia tried to assert its claim to Oregon country. Secretary of State Adams rejected that Russia had any right, any claim to North America at all. Russia would accept the 54-degree, 40-minute line as the southern boundary for Alaska. In 1827, the U.S. and Great Britain extended indefinitely their joint occupation of the area. But the Monroe administration is kind of worried about rumblings in Europe and attempts to help Spain regain its colonies in South America, but nothing came to that. And Monroe stated the Indian address in 1823 included a number of John Quincy Adams' major points on American foreign policy to become the Monroe Doctrine. This would come to define U.S. Latin American policy in the decades to come. That basically, 1, the American continents were not to be considered for future colonization by the European powers. 2, that since the European political system was different from the United States, any attempt to extend a system that is colonization, monarchy to the Western Hemisphere, they consider it dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States. 3, the United States would not interfere with existing European colonies, 4, the United States not interfere in European wars. Basically, what Monroe is telling Europe is, you stay on your side of the world, we'll stay on ours. And I said, we'll mind our business if you mind your business. Basically, we'll stay on separate sides of the world and won't bother each other. What do you think Europe's response to this was? None at all. They ignored it. Largely ignored even the United States, but what's going to end up happening, though, in future decades, especially as Europeans after the Civil War try to accelerate their colonization and influence in the Americas, the United States is going to invoke the Monroe Doctrine to keep them out of the Western Hemisphere. In fact, even be briefly invoked during the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s. Well, 1824, Monroe steps down. You have an election in a one-party political system. So the old congressional caucus, state legislatures are endorsing candidates. Congressional caucus was being attacked as an elitist and out of date. People trying to break the Virginia dynasty once and for all. What ended up happening is Andrew Jackson being nominated for the Tennessee legislature, among others. John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State Henry Clay, Speaker of the House Henry Clay, and William Crawford, the Secretary of the Treasury. So basically you have a four-way election in a political system with one political party. No opposition party. It's one party, they're split four ways. So only two candidates have clearly defined programs. Clay calls his American system a national bank, protective tariffs, and internal improvements. Adams had a program similar to Clay, but not quite as defined. Jackson's basically trying to win on his military fame, and he had a lot of it in 1824. But the election turned on sectional allegiances and personalities. Adams ended up winning New England, most of New York's electoral votes. Jackson, the Southeast, Illinois and Indiana, Carolinas, and so forth. Clay gets Kentucky, Ohio, and Missouri. Crawford gets basically Georgia, Virginia, and Delaware. Jackson gets 99 electoral votes, but only 43.1% of the popular votes. Adams gets 84 electoral votes, 30.5% of the popular votes. This is the first election in which the popular vote really starts becoming important. Crawford gets 41 electoral votes, 13.1% of the popular votes. And Clay gets 37 electoral votes, 13.2% of the votes. But even though Jackson won most of the popular votes, he doesn't get a majority of the electoral votes, which is required to win the presidency under the 12th Amendment. So it has to go to the House of Representatives. Or guess who's calling the shots? Henry Clay, who hates Andrew Jackson. Well, in the second round of voting in the House of Representatives, Adams gets 13 votes, Jackson 7 to Crawford's 4.
And is this where that influenced Jackson that there may have been a corrupt bargain?
Yes. Like say, John Quincy Adams, the nation's 6th president, Calhoun, chosen by the Senate as vice president. But Henry Clay being named as Secretary of State, which basically was going to be a stepping stone to the presidency at that point, people were assuming that Clay threw the votes to Adams to make him president, Clay heir apparent. No evidence of this ever happening, but it looked bad and caused people to accuse Clay and Adams entering what they called a corrupt bargain to steal the presidency from Jackson. Sets the stage for the 1828 election.